late at night in a research facility worth more than most small countries, where the sharpest minds in America had gathered to solve a problem no one could crack. A single equation glowed on a glass wall like an accusation. Billions of dollars, careers on the line, a company's survival hanging from one unresolved variable. Down the hall, a man named Theodore pushed a mop bucket across cold linoleum, invisible to everyone. He paused. He looked. 5 seconds. One motion, and nothing would ever be the same. Helios Dynamics occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Austin, Texas, a company that had bet its entire future on a single breakthrough. The premise was elegant. A proprietary energy optimization algorithm capable of reducing industrial power consumption by 40%. If it worked, the technology was worth well over $1 billion in licensing contracts already sitting in legal review. If it didn't work, those contracts dissolved, and so did Helios Dynamics. The board had given CEO Scarlett Monroe 3 months to deliver a working model. That deadline was now 12 hours away. Scarlett was 28 years old, which made her the youngest chief executive in Helios Dynamics history, and depending on who was speaking, either a visionary or an overreaching liability. She had graduated summa cum laude from MIT at 20, earned a dual doctorate in applied physics and electrical engineering by 24, and spent the following 4 years convincing investors, government agencies, and her own board that she could do what no one else had managed to do: commercialize a branch of energy mathematics that most of the academic world considered theoretically sound, but practically unreachable. She was not cold by nature. She had simply learned, through years of being the youngest and often the only woman in the room, that warmth was a currency she could not afford to spend carelessly, so she kept it locked away, and what people saw instead was precision, efficiency, a controlled stillness that some mistook for arrogance. Theodore Marsh was 34 years old. He wore a gray uniform with his first name stitched above the left breast pocket, drove a 12-year-old pickup truck to work every night at 9, and clocked out at 5 in the morning to get home before his daughter woke up. She had her mother's eyes and her father's quietness, and she liked to draw pictures of horses on the backs of grocery receipts. Theodore kept every single one of them folded in his wallet. He had held the janitor position at Helios Dynamics for 14 months. Nobody on the science floor knew his last name. The researchers who worked late nights acknowledged him the way people acknowledge weather, an ambient presence that required no particular response. He returned that indifference without bitterness. He mopped floors. He emptied waste baskets. He replenished paper towels in the restrooms and made sure the glass in the conference room doors was always clean. He did his job quietly, and then he went home to his daughter. There was nothing about Theodore's posture or expression that invited questions. He moved through the building with the practiced efficiency of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that invisibility was not a loss but a choice. What no one at Helios Dynamics knew was that Theodore had once been something else entirely. The science team occupying the 4th floor had been assembled from the best research institutions in the country. Dr. Madia's 9. Christopher Vane led the group, a 47-year-old theoretical physicist from Stanford with 17 published papers, 2 industry awards, and the particular confidence of a man who had never been wrong in public. Beneath him, a rotating cast of postdoctoral researchers and senior engineers had spent 92 days attacking the optimization equation from every angle they could conceive. They had tried adaptive modeling. They had tried dimensional reduction. They had tried 3 separate algorithmic frameworks pulled from aerospace, computational biology, and financial modeling. Every approach converged on the same problem: a nonlinear coupling term in the central equation that refused to yield a stable solution. It sat there like a locked door, and nobody could find the key. The pressure had been building for weeks, but it reached a new pitch on the evening of the final deadline. Scarlett had called an emergency meeting at 9 o'clock. She stood at the head of the conference table with a calm that everyone in the room recognized as the thin crust over something volcanic, and she asked a simple question: "Where are we?" Christopher delivered the answer in the tone of a man performing a post-mortem. The coupling term, he explained, was exhibiting behavior inconsistent with the model's foundational assumptions. They needed more time. 2 weeks, minimum. Possibly a month. The algorithm, as currently structured, could not be stabilized before morning. Scarlett did not raise her voice. She said, "We don't have 2 weeks. Then she ended the meeting. In the hallway outside the conference room, Christopher lingered with two of his junior researchers, and his voice carried farther than he intended. "This isn't a problem for ordinary people," he said, with the particular dismissiveness of someone who had just been embarrassed and needed to redirect. "There are maybe 6 people on Earth who could see a path through that equation, and none of them are in this building tonight." Theodore was mopping the floor 20 feet away. He had his back turned, head down, moving the mop in long, even strokes. His cart's wheel had a slight squeak that Christopher had stopped noticing weeks ago. Theodore did not turn around when he heard the comment. He did not react visibly at all, but his hand slowed on the mop handle, just slightly, and after a moment, he shifted his angle so that he could see the glass wall of the conference room from the corner of his eye. The equation was still on the board. 16 lines. A cascade of variables and operators that most people would need 20 minutes just to parse. Theodore parsed it in approximately 8 seconds, and what he saw made his jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. He pushed the cart forward. He kept walking. He went down the hall and did not look back. The apartment Theodore shared with Chloe was on the 3rd floor of a brick building in East Austin, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a narrow kitchen with a window that caught the morning light just right. Chloe called it their castle. Theodore called it home. On the rare nights he got back early enough, he would stand in her doorway for a moment after she fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, and feel something that had no clean name, gratitude, and grief fused together into a single quiet ache. Her mother, Diane, had died 3 years ago. A car accident on a Sunday morning in November, the kind of random, senseless event that rewrites everything that comes after it. Theodore had been at a conference in Boston when it happened, a mathematics conference, the kind where young researchers presented early-stage work and older researchers decided whose careers were worth cultivating. He had been presenting his own paper, a foundational theoretical framework for energy state optimization in nonlinear coupled systems. Work he had spent 4 years developing, work that had attracted serious attention from 2 major research institutions and an energy conglomerate with deep pockets. He had flown home to a hospital and then to a funeral, and he had never gone back to that world. The formal version of what happened next was uncomplicated. Theodore Marsh withdrew from his doctoral program at the University of Texas at 29 years old and did not return. The actual version was more complicated. In the months after Diane's death, while he was barely functional, his research had been absorbed quietly, methodically, without his knowledge or consent, into the foundational documents of a project being developed by a colleague he had trusted. The attribution was removed. The theoretical backbone Theodore had constructed over 4 years appeared in published form, under a different name, reformulated just enough to complicate any legal challenge. By the time Theodore understood what had happened, the cost of fighting it financially, emotionally, with a 3-year-old daughter who needed a present father was higher than he could afford to pay. So he walked away. He took a series of jobs that kept him physically occupied and mentally quiet. Security guard, warehouse worker, janitor. He was good at all of them, and none of them asked anything of the part of his brain he had decided to lock away. He paid his bills, coached Chloe's soccer team on Saturday mornings, and read advanced topology textbooks at the kitchen table after she went to sleep, the same way other men might watch television. Not to go anywhere, just to keep the lights on in a room he no longer planned to enter. It was Chloe, 2 weeks earlier, who had accidentally handed him the key. She had been drawing a horse at the kitchen table, and she had looked up at him with complete seriousness and asked, "Dad, why do you always start in the middle?" He had been helping her with a puzzle. She had watched him skip to the centerpieces instead of building the border first. It was a small observation, the kind a 6-year-old makes without knowing what she's said. Theodore had laughed, helped her finish the puzzle, and put her to bed. But the question had lodged somewhere in his thinking, and it was still there 3 hours later when he walked into the Helios Dynamics building and began his shift. By 2 in the morning, the 4th floor had emptied except for one room. The simulation lab at the end of the east corridor still had its lights on. And through the glass Theodore could see Marcus Webb, the team's senior computational engineer, alone at a workstation, running the same verification loop for what appeared to be the 4th or 5th time. The result was the same each time. Marcus would lean back, drag a hand across his face, and start again. The main conference room, which Theodore had skipped earlier in the evening, still had the equation on the board. The room was empty now. Someone had left a half-full coffee cup on the table and a legal pad covered in margin notes, all of them crossed out. Theodore pushed his cart to the doorway. He looked at the equation. The error was not subtle, exactly, but it was the kind of error you could only see if you approached the problem from a specific direction. One that the team had clearly never tried, because it ran counter to the dominant methodology in the field. They were treating the coupling term as a boundary condition, when it was, in fact, a dynamic input. The entire system had been structured around a false assumption that had been baked into the foundational literature for so long that questioning it had stopped feeling like an option. Theodore had identified this class of error before. He had spent 4 years building a framework specifically designed to avoid it. He knew, within about 30 seconds of re-examining the board, exactly what the correction required. He also knew it was not his problem. He pulled a cloth from the cart and began wiping down the conference table. He worked from one end to the other, moving the legal pad, repositioning the coffee cup. He did not look at the board again. He was almost to the door when Chloe's question surfaced without warning in the back of his mind, not as a thought, but as a sound. Her voice in the kitchen 2 weeks ago, completely certain. "Why do you always start in the middle?" He stopped. He stood at the doorway for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he turned around, walked to the equipment tray near the wall, and picked up a whiteboard marker that someone had left uncapped. He stood in front of the board for exactly 5 seconds. He made one modification, a single variable reclassification in the coupling term that reframed the entire structure of the problem. 4 characters, a subscript change and a new boundary notation. Anyone who knew what they were looking at would understand immediately. Anyone who didn't would see nothing but a small mark near the bottom of a crowded equation. Theodore capped the marker, set it back on the tray, and pushed his cart out of the room. He was 3 floors down, reloading paper towels in the second-floor men's room, when Marcus Webb walked back into the conference room and stopped completely still. Marcus had come back for his jacket. He noticed the change before he reached the table. The equation was familiar enough by now that any variation registered immediately. The way a misplaced word registers in a sentence, you've read 100 times. He set down his jacket. He stepped closer. He read the modification twice, then looked away and looked back at it. The way you do when you're not sure you're seeing what you think you're seeing. He picked up a marker and began checking the logic. It took him 11 minutes. He worked through 3 pages of the legal pad, and by the end of it he was standing very still, holding the marker at his side, staring at a result that should not have been possible at this stage of the night. The modification didn't just stabilize the coupling term. It dissolved the entire nonlinear barrier by recontextualizing the variable in a way that made the original constraint obsolete. The equation, which had resisted every effort for 3 months, now resolved cleanly to a deterministic solution. Marcus checked it again. Then he picked up his phone and called Christopher. Christopher arrived 17 minutes later, still in his overcoat, and the conversation that followed was conducted almost entirely in silence. He checked Marcus's work. He checked it again. He stood with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable for a long moment, and then he went to the simulation terminal and ran the model. The model ran clean. He ran it again with a different data set. Clean again. He ran it a 3rd time with the most extreme parameters they had tested during the original trial phase, the parameters that had previously caused catastrophic instability within the first few computational cycles. The simulation completed with a stability margin of 96%. Christopher said nothing for a long time. Then he turned and looked at the camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, the standard security camera that recorded all work on the 4th floor as part of the company's intellectual property protocol. He looked at it the way a person looks at a witness they hadn't noticed until it was too late. By 3 in the morning, Scarlett was in the building. She had not been asleep. She reviewed the simulation results herself, asked Marcus 4 questions in quick succession, and then stood at the conference room board for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. The modification was spare, almost insultingly simple, given the scale of the problem it resolved. That was what made it convincing. There was no performance in it. Whoever had made that change had not been trying to impress anyone, they had simply seen something and corrected it. She asked Marcus to pull the security footage. The timestamp showed 9 minutes after 2 in the morning. A janitor's cart appeared in the frame at the doorway. The figure pushed it into the room, moved to the table, wiped it down. Then he paused, walked to the marker tray, picked up a marker, and stood at the board for 5 seconds. The modification was made in a single, economical motion. The marker was capped and replaced. The figure left the room. Scarlett watched the clip 3 times. Then she asked Marcus for the employee's name. Theodore was informed the following morning, via a message from building administration, that his presence was requested on the 4th floor at 10 o'clock. The phrasing was neutral enough that it carried no particular alarm. He arrived in his gray uniform 5 minutes early and was shown into a small meeting room he had cleaned many times. Scarlett was already there, along with Christopher and a woman named Patricia from the company's legal team. Theodore sat down across from them. He folded his hands on the table. Christopher opened with the question directly. Had Theodore altered the equation on the main conference room board the previous night? Theodore said yes. The room adjusted slightly. Christopher exchanged a glance with Patricia. Scarlett asked Theodore to explain his reasoning. Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the coupling term was misclassified. Treating it as a fixed boundary condition was propagating instability through the whole system. Reclassifying it as a dynamic input removes the constraint. He said it the way a person explains which lane to take on a familiar road, not impatiently, but without embellishment. Christopher's expression underwent a subtle recalibration. That's a very clean description of a modification that took our team 3 months to approach, he said. Where did you learn to read that kind of equation? Theodore said. I picked it up. This was not the answer Christopher was looking for. He leaned forward slightly. The mathematics involved in that system are postgraduate level advanced postgraduate. To be precise, topology, nonlinear dynamics, energy state modeling. You can't just pick that up. Theodore looked at him without particular feeling and said nothing. The meeting became less like a conversation and more like an interrogation at a pace so gradual, it was difficult to identify exactly when the shift occurred. Christopher kept returning to the idea that the modification, while technically correct, might have been made based on information Theodore should not have had access to. A photograph of someone's notes, perhaps. A communication with a former team member. He didn't say it directly. He said it in the way academics say things they don't want attributed to them, through implication and the careful deployment of hypotheticals. Scarlett watched Theodore's face throughout. He did not get defensive. He did not look away. He answered the questions he chose to answer, and let the others sit in silence, without visible discomfort. The moment the room tipped into open hostility came when Christopher said, with the particular weariness of a man performing patience, "Look, it could simply have been a fortunate accident. You may have seen something that happened to map onto a real solution without fully understanding why it worked. That happens." Theodore looked at Christopher for a moment. Then he looked at Scarlett. Then he stood up and said, quietly, that he needed to finish his shift. Scarlett told him, just as quietly, that he should stay available. There would be additional questions. He left the room without replying. In the hallway outside, he took a slow breath, rolled his cart to the service elevator, and went back to work. His face was the same as it always was, but his hands, around the mop handle, were gripping harder than usual. Scarlett did not believe Christopher's hypothesis. This was not a generous instinct, it was a mathematical one. She had spent enough time with the equation to understand the precision required to make that correction, and precision at that level was not a product of luck. It was a product of deep, structural understanding, the kind that took years to build. She went to the footage again. She watched Theodore's movements, the way he stood at the board, the economy of his posture, the complete absence of hesitation. He had not stood there thinking. He had stood there the way people stand in front of something they already know the answer to, pausing not out of uncertainty, but out of decision. She pulled his employee file. It was thin, as janitor files tend to be. Employment start date. Clean background check. 2 brief performance notes from his supervisor. Both positive. No education history beyond a high school diploma, because Theodore had not offered one and no one had asked. She ran his name through a general search and found almost nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. She contacted the University of Texas Mathematics Department. The response came from Professor Leonard Holt, who had been a senior faculty member in applied mathematics for 26 years. He did not respond to her initial inquiry with information. He responded with a question. What was the context? When Scarlett described the modification to the optimization equation, the nature of the framework it implied, and the name attached to her inquiry, Professor Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Theodore Marsh. He said it the way people say a name they haven't spoken in years, but haven't forgotten. Holt told Scarlett that Theodore had been, in his assessment, among the 3 most naturally gifted mathematics students he had encountered in his career. Not merely intelligent, structurally original, the kind of mind that didn't just learn frameworks but saw through them, identifying the assumptions buried so deep in a field's methodology that most practitioners had stopped noticing they were assumptions at all. His early doctoral work, Holt said, had contained a theoretical framework for nonlinear energy state optimization that was unlike anything currently in the literature. Scarlett asked what had happened to it. Holt's answer was careful. The work, he said, had been published but not by Theodore. The attribution had gone to another researcher. Theodore had withdrawn from the program shortly afterward. Holt said he had suspected at the time that something irregular had occurred. But Theodore had declined to pursue the matter, and without Theodore's cooperation, there had been nothing Holt could formally do. Scarlett ended the call and sat for a moment with the particular stillness of someone absorbing information that has changed the shape of everything around it. She went back to the Helios Dynamics project documentation, the foundational research file, the theoretical basis document that Christopher had co-authored with a former Caltech researcher 3 years ago. She read the methodology section with a different set of eyes than she'd used before. The framework was elegant. It was original. It was also, she now understood, the direct descendant of work done by a man who was currently mopping a hallway 2 floors below her. The coupling term, the approach to nonlinear classification, the specific notation, all of it traced back to a conceptual architecture that Theodore had built, and that had been taken from him in the period when he was least equipped to defend it. She called Christopher into her office and asked him a single question. Who had originally developed the classification framework underlying the project's core methodology? Christopher's answer was smooth and immediate, and factually incomplete, in a way that told Scarlett everything she needed to know. She thanked him. She asked him to wait outside. Then she picked up the phone and called the board. The board meeting convened the following afternoon in Helios Dynamics' main assembly space, a high-ceilinged room on the 4th floor used for company-wide presentations and investor briefings. All 37 members of the research and engineering staff were present, along with the 12-person board of directors and the 4 senior members of the executive team. It was the kind of gathering that normally preceded either a major announcement or a significant restructuring. Nobody was sure which this was. Scarlett stood at the front of the room for a long moment before she spoke. She had prepared nothing written. She looked once at the back of the room, where Theodore was standing near the wall he had been asked to be present and had not been told why, which he had accepted without comment, arriving in his gray uniform, hands at his sides. Scarlett spoke for approximately 12 minutes. She covered the history of the project's core methodology, the origins of the theoretical framework that Helios Dynamics had built its algorithm upon, and the sequence of events that had produced a working solution the previous night. She was precise. She did not editorialize. She presented the facts in the order she had assembled them, including Professor Holt's account, the documentation she had pulled from the foundational research files, and the timestamp from the security footage. She named the people involved. She did not soften the names. When she reached the end of the factual account, she said, "The intellectual foundation of this company's most important project was built by one person and attributed to another. That is the record as it stands. It is not a record I am willing to leave uncorrected." The room was very quiet. Christopher was seated 3 rows back from the front. He had kept his expression controlled throughout, but by the time Scarlett said the word uncorrected, something in the architecture of his composure had shifted visibly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight rigidity in the jaw that was not quite defiance, and not quite shame, and was, in some ways, both. He was asked to resign his position, effective that afternoon. He did not argue. He left the room while Scarlett was still at the front, and the sound of the door closing was the loudest thing that had happened in a long time. Then Scarlett looked to the back of the room. She asked Theodore to come forward. He did not move for a moment. Then he pushed off the wall and walked to the front of the room through 37 people who were now watching him with expressions ranging from surprise to calculation, to something that sat closer to recognition, as though a figure they had passed in the hallway 100 times had just been revealed as something else entirely. He stood beside Scarlett. She did not stand in front of him. She said, "I owe you an apology. This company owes you an apology for what was taken from you and not acknowledged, and for the way you were treated in this building yesterday. I'm sorry." She said it simply and completely, without the performative humility that apologies sometimes carry when they're also meant to be witnessed. Theodore looked at her for a moment. He nodded once. She told him that the position of project director for the optimization initiative was his if he wanted it. Full compensation, full attribution, complete intellectual ownership of the framework he had built. She told the room that this was not a courtesy offer, it was a correction. The silence stretched for 3 or 4 seconds. Then someone started clapping. Then someone else. By the time it built to the whole room, it was the unambiguous kind, not polite, not obligatory, but genuine, the sound of people who had just watched something settle into its rightful shape. Theodore stood there and let it wash over him. His expression did not change much, but his eyes were bright. Later that afternoon, in a smaller conference room, Theodore told Scarlett he would not take the director position. She did not look surprised. Exactly. She set down the folder she'd been holding and waited. He said, "I have a daughter. She's 6. I've missed enough." He said it plainly, without apology or explanation, the way a man states a fact he's made peace with. Scarlett was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood. She asked if there was something else he would consider. He said he'd be willing to serve as a senior technical consultant on the project. Review of the core framework. Guidance on the modeling approach. Limited hours. He would set his own schedule. He would not be on-site full-time. Those were the terms. Scarlett said yes without negotiating. He stood to leave, and she said, "You didn't have to say anything to me yesterday about the methodology or where any of it came from. You just could have walked away." She paused. "Why did you stay in the building that night?" Theodore thought about it. "My daughter asked me why I always start in the middle," he said. She was talking about a puzzle, but I kept thinking about it. Scarlett looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Smart kid." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "Yeah," he said. "She is." Chloe was waiting outside the building. Theodore had arranged for his neighbor, Mrs. Packard, to bring her after school, not knowing how long the day would run. Chloe was sitting on the low concrete ledge by the entrance, drawing something in a small notebook she carried everywhere. She looked up when Theodore came through the glass doors, and she looked past him at the building, at the people moving through the lobby. The cluster of research staff who had followed out after the meeting, a few of whom nodded to Theodore as they passed him on the sidewalk. Small gestures. A word or two. Acknowledgement that had not existed yesterday. Chloe watched all of this with the careful attention of a child who understands more than she's given credit for. Then she looked at her father. "Did something good happen?" she asked. Theodore crouched down to her level. "Yeah," he said. "Something good happened." She showed him what she'd been drawing. It was a horse, as usual, but this one was running. Theodore looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and put it in his wallet with the others. They walked to the truck together, Chloe carrying her notebook, Theodore with his jacket over one arm. He helped her with her seatbelt, went around to the driver's side, and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel before starting the engine. Through the windshield, the glass tower of Helios Dynamics caught the late afternoon sun in a way that made it look, briefly, like something on fire. He started the truck. He pulled out of the lot. He did not look back at the building, but his shoulders, for the first time in a long time, sat slightly lower, not slumped, but eased. As though something that had been held for years had finally been set down. 3 weeks later, the optimization algorithm passed its final validation benchmark with a stability margin that exceeded projections by 11%. The licensing agreements were signed. Helios Dynamics, which had been preparing quiet contingency plans for an orderly wind-down, instead found itself with a 12-month runway and 2 additional contracts in negotiation. The board, which had been positioning itself for a difficult conversation with Scarlett, held an emergency session and did the opposite, extending her contract by 3 years. Theodore still mopped floors. This was his choice, and he had stated it clearly. His consulting arrangement occupied 8 to 12 hours per week. And those hours he gave with complete attention, clean, technical thinking, direct feedback, no performance. The rest of the time he was what he had been before. A man in a gray uniform, with his name above the left breast pocket, moving through the building with unhurried efficiency. The difference was in how the building moved around him. Researchers who had walked past him for over a year without registering his face now said his name in the hallway. They did not treat him differently in any dramatic or performative way. He would not have tolerated that, and something in his manner communicated as much. But the casual dismissal was gone. In its place was something quieter and more durable. Simple recognition. Scarlett began stopping by the maintenance corridor on the east side of the 4th floor, which was Theodore's first stop of the evening shift, more frequently than the building's administrative needs required. She would stand near the doorway with a coffee and say something technical, a question about the latest modeling run, or a structural problem she'd been turning over, and Theodore would answer while he worked, not setting down the mop, not making it a larger moment than it was. These conversations were brief, they were substantive, and they were becoming, quietly, the most useful part of her day. She did not examine this too closely. Theodore gave no indication that he did either. But there was a gentleness in the way they occupied the same space, now a mutual ease that had not been there before, that neither of them had manufactured or announced. One evening Chloe came to the building with Theodore before his shift began, because the school had closed early and Mrs. Packard was unavailable. She sat in the lobby with her notebook and a juice box, and drew horses with tremendous concentration. Scarlett came down for a 10-minute briefing with Marcus, and saw her there on the way back to the elevators. She stopped. She looked at the drawing. Chloe was working on a horse mid-stride, the legs precise, and said, genuinely, "That's very good." Chloe looked up. "I know," she said, without arrogance. "The way children state true things." Scarlett laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it changed her face entirely. Outside, the city moved through its evening rhythms. Inside, a janitor who had once changed a billion-dollar equation in 5 seconds pushed his cart to the elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor, and the building, quietly, made room for him. Not everyone who is silent is invisible. Not everyone who holds a mop holds only a mop. Sometimes the person who saves everything is the one no one thought to look at twice. And sometimes, it only takes 5 seconds for the world to catch up to what was always true.